Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor. With all the talk in this town about the indictments of President Trump and Joe Biden enjoying his sunny vacation on the beach in Delaware, you probably missed a pretty big story. You missed it because our media, well, they really don't get into the business of reporting news, but we'll report it. In a joint military exercise, Russia and China working together had 11 warships just off the coast of Alaska in the Aleutian Islands. That's U.S. territory, and they were coming up right against it. We ended up sending 4 destroyers to send a message that they should back off. But I don't know. I remember when Joe Biden was running for president, he was going to restore our military, restore our national security, restore our standing in the world. And now suddenly Russia and China is working together. I don't think that's a good sign. Joining us right now is Senior Research Fellow for the Center for National Defense over at Heritage Foundation and Navy officer, retired, Brent Sadler. Mr. Sadler, thanks for joining us, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
This is, am I overstating the case? I mean, Russia and China didn't used to do stuff like this together. What's changed?
Wherever there is a political or power vacuum, you can bet your adversaries are going to fill it. And so that's what's happened here. Over the last few years, weak or tepid responses to this increasing naval presence in our own backyard in the Bering Sea off of Alaska. This has just been allowed to progress to a point to where we have this highly provocative naval exercise where they've actually done live fires and hunting submarines, which is a varsity sport in naval warfare.
Ooh. Your book, by the way, U.S. Naval Power in the 21st Century, a new strategy for facing the Chinese and Russian threat, sort of fits literally right in with this scenario, what we're seeing over there. We've always had superiority with our submarines. Is this disconcerting that their main goal is to hunt for subs?
Well, it's not that it's a direct threat to or challenges our supremacy in the undersea realm. We still have an edge there, but we have to guard it and we have to double down our investments to keep that. What's really troubling about this is the fact that you have two very, large and dangerous rivals working at a varsity level of naval warfare competencies, anti-submarine warfare, in our own backyard. So it's highly provocative in that regard. And it's also historic because it's 11 ships. It's the largest that we've seen of this type of activity off our coast by the Chinese and the Russians together.
Are they sending a message to us, or are they sending a message to the rest of the world, Taiwan, other nations, like, hey, we're not afraid of the U.S., so if we come knocking on your door, be ready for us? It's
actually both. Right now, there's an exercise in Australia that's wrapping up with 13 of our allies called Talisman Sabre. It was not any veiled threat. State-run news in China, like Global Times, was saying that this exercise that started in the Sea of Japan and progressed up into the Bering Sea was in response to that. So the message is clear to the United States that China and Russia are working together and that the United States has more problems than just dealing with individually Russia and China. The other part of this is it's also really determined on how weak or how strong our response is, a message to other countries in the region that the United States is or is not a reliable security partner. And hopefully the message is sent with this increased naval presence on our part that we still remain a viable and reliable security partner.
It didn't get a whole lot of news, as usual. I really do. I hate attacking the media in this town as much as I do, but they really ignore our national security. They ignore our military. I don't think they know what they're talking about half the time if they try to cover it. There wasn't much coverage of our new alliance with Australia, specifically with regard to shared technology and crafts in the submarine realm. How important is that alliance now going forward, considering what we're seeing?
Well, our alliance is, first and foremost with the Australians and the AUKUS deal to help develop an indigenous nuclear submarine program. That's key. That's something that the Chinese and the Russians can't replicate. They don't have that degree of trust and allies network that like we have, and an allies that we are together, because we've shed blood together, especially like the Australians and the New Zealanders, but also allies like the Japanese and the South Koreans. So that is a significant advantage, but it's not going to be enough. The Chinese themselves have been spending double digits in their defense spending and growing their military and modernizing at breakneck speed for 20 years. And so we can't rest on this alliance network without investing ourselves to be a reliable and strong partner in that.
We're seeing high drama right now in Eastern Europe, of course, with the Ukraine-Russian war continuing, and a lot of talk about the NATO alliance and whether it needs to be reexamined, restructured. We've expanded now from Scandinavian countries as well. We have alliances with Pacific nations, but it's not a NATO-like alliance. Is it time? Is it time to actually think of a NATO-like alliance with other countries on the Pacific Rim specifically to face down the Chinese threat?
We've had similar things in our history, and they've never really worked very well. And SEATO is one, and it kind of came to a conclusion in the late 70s. The culture, the political environment, and the history doesn't really lend itself to a NATO-like organization. I mean, NATO really, the trigger for it was Soviet blockade of Berlin. And that actually triggered and woke up the United States. It was several Western European countries that were trying to get us to enter into it, that the threat was real from the Soviet Union. The Chinese, the corollary is Taiwan. Taipei is the modern day Berlin. And it might be, but I don't think we're going to see an exact replica of something like a NATO, but certainly common cause through organizations that are loose and unofficial, like the Quad with India, the US, Japan, and Australia. But we might see something more, an alignment or a coalition that'll start to form in a very real way with coordinated military operations and like AUKUS, where we're investing in each other's military industrial complex.
I'm curious as to your observations about what we do hear from the Pentagon and the actions that are. I mean, our Secretary of Defense recently visited Asia. Our Secretary of State was just in China. It didn't look like a very successful trip.
Yeah.
Right now, the relationship seems to be China sort of dismissing, if not disrespecting, the American
Yes.
government under this president. And you don't hear a whole lot from the Pentagon about issues like readiness and about whether we're technically capable and ready to go if we need to go.
Yeah, sadly, so at Heritage Foundation, every year we do an index of military strength. The news just isn't good there. So there's not a lot that the Biden administration can really put out and say, hey, look at the good progress that we've made. That just isn't there. That being said, words only go so far, and having key leaders go into engagements, it's empty unless you've got some military power and economic might that's behind it in a real way. In other words, present in the region, that the Chinese can kind of register that against the words and the dialogue. And so you're right. The engagements in Beijing the last few months have been a failure because the Chinese are not really seeing any benefit to engage us. There's nothing that we have are willing to give and nothing that they really are seeking. The other part of it is our military needs to be more proactive in the Western Pacific as well. I think the trends that we see with this surface action group, the Chinese and Russians up in Alaska, that's a positive indicator, but it's still too small and it needs to be sustained. And that's the real question as I look forward, because if we drop off that presence, that'll send a very negative signal to the region and our potential partners. Most importantly, it sends a provocative signal to Beijing that, our staying power is not very good.
Yeah, and meanwhile, our recruitment continues to miss the mark, but in a big way. And it's no wonder, I think, sadly, because of the readiness numbers you just laid out there from Heritage Foundation's analysis. Listen, Brett, I appreciate you joining us. You should be a man in demand today, given the events that we've seen. And we'll call on you again, I'm sure, as this story is not going away. Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you. There was one last point. I mean, for every American, this actually ends up in a dollar value, especially in the fishing grounds off of Alaska. In 2020, when this happened and the Russians did an exercise, they cost American fishermen $1.5 million in lost catch because they were operating in our economic exclusion zone. So it is a real impact on Americans.
Yeah, it should get more coverage. I'm glad we're talking about it tonight. More to come, O'Connor, tonight.